welcome to a new edition of Grant's World. I just wanted to talk a little bit about our membership meeting we held in Washington, D.C. recently. We had about 85 members attend. We stayed at the beautiful Willard Hotel, which was just fabulous, and within walking distance to a lot of things that we were doing. We had some outstanding speakers. We had Dr. Ryan Sims from the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, and he talked about the Grant Doctrine, defining citizenship during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. We had Candace Shy Hooper. She talked about when Grant made Kentucky howl, the U.S. mail and passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. That was followed by Ulysses S. Grant Dietz, a member of our board of directors, and he talked about Julia and Ulysses at home, the Grants in the White House, 1869 to 1877. On Saturday morning, we took a tour of the new student-led exhibit, Rethinking Legacy and Memory, behind the image of Ulysses S. Grant, where they had some outstanding displays at the George Washington University Brady Gallery of the Cochran School of Art. On Saturday night, we had a presentation by Dr. Charles Calhoun. There never was such a president in the White House. The political leadership of Ulysses S. Grant. All of the speakers did a marvelous job, and it was very interesting to hear these topics on Grant. One of the highlights of the meeting was the visit and tour of the Decatur House, which is one of the oldest surviving homes in Washington, D.C. And this year's John Y. Simon Award went to Edna Green Medford for all her outstanding contributions to the Grant Association. On Sunday, we concluded with a board meeting and an overflowing crowd of our members. I wanted to say where we're going next year. That'll be St. Louis, Missouri, and the dates for that is May 2nd through the 5th, so as not to interfere with a lot of the birthday celebrations that are going on with Grant. So we can get a lot of our members have other commitments, so we thought this would work fine. You'll hear more about it, but it's May 2nd through the 5th. And one of the things we're doing differently is we're going to use Friday as a full day of sightseeing. We have, hopefully, we'll get hardscrabble in there. We're working on that, but there'll be a lot of things for us to do and see with a full day Friday and Saturday. So we have an interesting program, so let's go ahead and get started.
Greetings from the Grant Presidential Library. So you might notice I'm not in my normal lair today. We thought we'd do a little something different for this newsletter. I am always promising you more details on our much anticipated new facility that will be being built sometime in the next few years. And so I thought today I would take you all outside to see our brand new site. So it might not look like much right now, but we are so excited about this site because it is perfectly located in Starkville. We are along a very busy corridor. We're at the corner of Starkville's Russell Street and Highway 12, which is sort of the main business corridor through town. And so anyone who comes into Starkville comes through this area, and they'll be driving by our brand new library. And people don't typically get too excited about building parking lots, but we're the exception here because we can't wait to have our own parking that will make it easier for people to come visit us and easy to park and walk right into the facility, which is something we don't enjoy right now. We're also really conveniently located to two different hotels, one that'll be right next to us, a nice Courtyard by Marriott, and also another hotel right across the street. We're also located next to one of the most historic buildings in Starkville, which is a building called the Mill. It was built in 1902 as you guessed it, a textile mill that turned all of this Mississippi cotton that was grown around here into really high quality fabric. And This mill had been redone in the last 10 years and turned into some offices, but also some really nice conference space. So our neighbors in our new spot are going to be perfectly poised to provide a lot of great accommodations and activities for any visitors that come. We're also going to be within easy walking distance from the football stadium, so that's going to be great on game days when we hope we'll have lots of people who are coming into Starkville, not just to watch SEC football, but also to come visit our Grant Presidential Library. We're also in great spirits around the U.S. Grant Presidential Library because we're coming off a fabulous meeting that we had in Washington, D.C. just last month, and we're also already gearing up for next year's meeting, which is going to be right outside of St. Louis, based around the Ulysses S. Grant historic site there. And so keep your eyes peeled. We'll be announcing the date soon and making arrangements and sharing those with you as we develop those. And in the meantime, please keep up with all that's happening at the library through following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Until next time.
Was Grant a butcher? Ulysses S. Grant today sometimes has the reputation of being a butcher, that he sent men headlong into battle in frontal charges time and time again, mindlessly, trying to hammer away at Confederate positions at a terrible cost of life. Unfortunately, he's been saddled with that because of a lot of propaganda, particularly in post-war years. In fact, Grant did use a lot of headlong charges, but it was one of several tools that he kept in his toolbox. If you look at the Overland campaign in 1864 as an example, he did frontal assaults, but he also did a lot of maneuvers. He also tried to improvise and adapt and change and learn from what he was up to. So in fact, Grant had many tools at his disposal. If we rewind to 1863, looking at the Vicksburg campaign, it's an excellent example of Grant's ability to move and maneuver and adapt on the fly. Unfortunately, he's remembered most for those headlong charges because they're dramatic and bloody and because they served a propaganda purpose to try to deflate his successes. But in fact, there are instances where Robert E. Lee lost more men in frontal assaults, such as at Pickett's Charge, than Grant did in frontal assaults, such as Cold Harbor, even though that's the one that tended to saddle him with the reputation of being a butcher, a reputation he did not deserve.
Thank you for joining us today, Richard. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much, Jim. Okay, my name is Richard Wilmot Smith. I rejoice under the title King's Counsel, which is something, it's basically a senior barrister who is basically an English litigator. You probably see them wearing wigs and gowns, and I've done that since the very late 70s and the early 80s. I mean, I was a junior, obviously, then. In 1994, I became a senior litigator. And I mainly practice in the sphere of construction and engineering, doing international arbitrations on major projects.
Thank you. And Richard, would you tell us a little bit about what got your interest in Grant?
Right. The thing which didn't get my attention, which will segue into this, was that I grew up really ignoring Grant. It was almost as if somebody had told me, you really mustn't be interested in this. And if you'd look at a $50 bill or wherever he appears, it's almost as if somebody had scratched his face out of it. Even though I went to college with a guy called Serge Cantacuzene Speransky, who by marriage is a descendant of Grant. But 2000 except of course that I was told of and knew about two things. One is that he was always drunk, and two, that he was one of the worst presidents of the United States. Oddly enough, then in the 70s and 80s, most people said he was a bad president because he he wasn't a strong president. Those were the days when everybody thought the president should be strong. Fast forward to 2003, I'm taking my kids to a vacation in the Catskills. And I went into one of these bookstores. I don't know whether you know about them, but in the Catskills, they still had then, I don't know whether they still now, lending libraries, which were very local, and you go in, you subscribe. And so I went into this lending library to see what books they had and see if I could borrow one. And I just pulled a book at random off the shelves, and it was a biography of Ulysses Grant. And I nearly put it back, but being a soul who liked pictures, I saw there were pictures, so I just turned the pages to the pictures. And open there was the picture of his funeral, where the crowds, well, as you know, Jim, but probably everybody else does too, the crowd started at the bottom of Manhattan and went all the way up. Probably the biggest funeral procession in the world ever, even now. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'll go and buy this book. So I went to the lady cashier, and she was one of the more forbidding types, and asked me where I lived. And I said, well, England, but I'm on vacation. He said, well, then I can't give you this book because it's you have to live locally. And I offered to buy it, and she wouldn't accept my money, so I put it back on the shelves. And I thought, well, I better find out about this guy. And I bought and then read a biography by Jean Edward Smith, which I think had then just come out, and that started it.
I understand that you also participate in the Ulysses S. Grant Association Book Club. Would you mind telling us about that experience? And I understand that you have to be up pretty late at night.
The Grant Book Club is terrific because it just allows you to talk about Grant and talk about books. I'm a book nutter. I'm being a lawyer, everything I do is written down, and I've read a lot about Grant, but it was just very nice to say, there's a book club here. I can talk to people about books that I've read, or I can be made to read books that I haven't, and see and talk to people about Grant. And it's a terrific experience. It does mean getting up very, very early, or actually, in my case, not going to bed.
What character traits interest you the most about Grant?
I'll be mean and say two. The first one is people can call you stubborn or persistent. One is the obverse of the other. And I think that is the most important one, because if you go through his life, particularly on the military side, it is the persistence, the dogged persistence, or as Lincoln would call it, chewing and choking, which is fascinating. You see the objective, as he did, and you would go for it, and you wouldn't give up. So there's that. That's the positive one. The other one, and which I find very interesting, is the inability, in his case, to spot that he's being betrayed. And you can learn that from a number of people who betrayed him at various stages. General Halleck, for example, Washburn, Charles Sumner, the Belknaps, and Adam Badeau, of course, at the end, all in different ways betrayed him. And I'm still trying to work out what it is about him which allowed him not to see that he was being had.
Jim, I'm really happy that you asked me to talk about the Grant image. I've been focusing on the Lincoln image for 50 years, but in between my research and my publications, I have studied and I have published some on Grant's image, which I think is a story in itself. And I start with this engraving of the Mexican War era Grant, almost unrecognizable to us, long-haired, clean-shaven, epaulets. This is the Sam Grant of an earlier day.
before he left the Army, and then, of course, resumed in 1861. Well, when Grant organized his unit in Illinois and marched off to his first encounters, he was unknown. But there was a market for images of new military figures, even if it was a very localized market. And engravers and lithographers would produce images of commanders, unit commanders, for the boys to send back home, for their wives and sweethearts to collect and save and decorate their walls with. And here's an early example of one of these, and it shows a general with a flowing beard, unlike anything Grant ever wore. And there's a good reason for that. Although it's identified as Ulysses S. Grant, it's not Ulysses S. Grant. And John Y. Simon was the first to recognize this. It's apparently a meat supplier named Grant who looked like this, enough like Grant for his photograph to be copied into this lithograph and distributed for a while as Ulysses S. Grant. These fakes were common at the time because, again, photographs hadn't circulated and people were unsure what the new general looked like. So who was this new guy? What kind of a general was he? Well, if you look at this next picture of Grant on horseback, you'd think he was the most flamboyant cavalier of the Civil War. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see more clearly. And here we have Grant, saber forward, wearing a feathered hat, leading what looks like a cavalry charge. Well, why this Grant? Because again, the printmakers are not absolutely sure who Ulysses S. Grant is. If we look at this next one, well, we'll say this is more like it. This is Grant mounted on his horse, but much more like the Grant we know. Plain uniform, that solid look. This is the Grant whose image we know. Of course, it's based on a photograph. So is this the real Grant that people were finally treated to around 1863? Well, this next image is what preceded it. And so as you can see, it originated as a print of total opposite to Grant, George B. McClellan. What the printmaker did is simply take this image when McClellan had lost his following, when he'd gone out of favor, and inserted the face of Ulysses S. Grant on McClellan's little body and created a new Grant image. It's kind of a cheat, but again, very, very common in the period. And here's a photograph of Grant, and it's familiar, so familiar to us, those who know Grant and his image, that I think we take it for granted in some ways. It is extraordinarily casual and spontaneous. A general just sort of leaning on a tree in front of a tent. That's not the kind of poses that generals or anybody were accustomed to supplying or having themselves immortalized in. One of the things is that photography has changed so much that more instantaneous photography is possible, almost informal photography. So this is one of my favorite Grant photographs. You see the camp chair to our left, to his right in the picture. Just a fabulous field photograph of Grant. But again, who is he modeled after? Who is he like? Well, I think this next image provides an idea. Old Rough and Ready, Zachary Taylor, maybe not comparable militarily, although both were military heroes who became president, but that informality, that roughness, that toughness. So naturally, the printmakers got an idea. Well, he's another Rough and Ready. So if you look at this next image, there's Grant's body simply put on the Grant's face simply put on the body of Zachary Taylor to become a Rough and Ready image of Ulysses S. Grant. So as you see, the image making is evolutionary. It's based on Grant's informality. And it's also based on some tricks of the trade in printmaking. shortcuts. Nobody's going to go and get an image of Grant holding his horse. First of all, he's not going to sit still for it. And second of all, why not? We have these old plates, these old stones, these ready-made designs. Let's just put another face on it and we can go to town and have an economic success with our new Grant image. No one will know it's Zachary Taylor until John Y. Simon and Harold Holzer figure it out, 100 years later. I don't know if this is one of John's discoveries, but since he started this field, I love giving him credit. People got it, right? They got it quickly. Look at this cartoon from Currier and Ives, and you've got the comparison between the reluctant little Mac, George McClellan, standing at Lincoln's side, dissuading him about Grant. And this is an 1864 political campaign, even though a political cartoon, even though McClellan is still in uniform. There's Grant as a bulldog. Even then, even as early as 1864, he's the old bulldog on the right track. He's sitting on the track to Richmond. He's the obstruction. And as it turns out, he's also the obstruction to McClellan's election. As you'll see in this next image, Grant does pose for paintings. They are celebrating him early. This is a wartime painting. And if you look at the next one, this is a famous one by Ole Balling, a Swedish painter, showing Grant in uniform beside, I always assume, the flaming city of Vicksburg. Now, once you create an image of a general with, the flames of war around you, the bulldog, the man standing in front of captured field pieces, well, when he becomes a political force, you need to soften that image a bit. Lincoln never enjoyed this. There are many. If we look at the next one, we'll see what I mean. It's called General Grant and His Family. There are many Lincoln family prints. There are Washington family prints, but they came after their deaths. Lincoln never posed for a photograph with his family. Never posed. Well, he did pose for a couple of pictures with his son, never with his wife. And after Lincoln's death, people kind of wanted assurance that Lincoln had enjoyed some solace from his family during the days of war. And with Grant, it was, he had been, to his detractors, he was a butcher. So he needed the images for a different reason, to show that he was a warm family man. So you have this print, or if you look at the next one, you have Grant in an even more romantic setting with Julia and the children. And these proliferated throughout the 1864 and 1868 campaigns to remind voters that he was not exclusively a military man, that the glorious record that had made him a presidential candidate in the first place could be softened and ameliorated by his loyalty and fealty to domestic concerns as well. In this case, literally domestic, at home. But of course, the Grant military image perpetuated long into the post-war period. And in the 1870s, the Boston printmaker Louis Prang issued a very famous series of chromolithographs, beautiful prints. This next one is one of them, showing Grant at Missionary Ridge, and these were marketed. These and 20 other prints of the highlights of the war marketed to veterans of the war and their survivors. Very influential, and these all based on paintings. This is based on a painting by Thor de Thalstrup, who is a military artist, and immortalized Grant further into the 1870s. If I had to choose one moment, there's always one moment that elevates a presidential image. In Lincoln's case, there were four. First, his introduction to the national public, and we saw Grant's introductory prints. Second, for Lincoln, it was growing a beard, creating a new kind of avuncular Father Abraham image. But the third and fourth things for Lincoln were more important. One was the Emancipation Proclamation, which transformed his image from that of a politician into that of the, quote, great emancipator, unquote. And then, of course, his assassination transformed him into the martyr of the Union. What was it for Grant? Well, if we look at this next print, I think this is the moment. Appomattox. There are many, many Appomattox prints, and their ubiquity alone suggests to me that it was the watershed moment in the Grant image. Why? Because he had achieved an equal, at least equal status with the revered image in the South of Robert E. Lee, the distinguished, the kind of dandified, elegant, cavalier general of the South, who, Grant was kind of dismissive about in his memoirs, thought was rather overrated. But just by sharing the stage, in this case, the McLean Parlor on the surrender day, Grant achieved more than status as Lincoln's general. He was Grant's equal and better. And printmakers, of course, could not just settle for pictures of the parlor. If you look at this next scene, this next lithograph, there Grant is accepting the surrender under the famous apple tree near the McLean Parlor. Now, the generals did meet the next day, but not to accept surrender terms. But here their entire armies are meeting. And Lee, in that gesture, that's a gesture of defeat in classical art. He is yielding. Even though he's wearing the white gloves and the fancier uniform, he's yielding to plain Sam Grant here. The next one is my favorite of all of them. This Kurtz and Allison image of this is like the entire army of both sides lined up in the woods. It looks almost like they're going to launch another battle. And here again, Grant accepting the surrender from Lee. And look at the conditions of the army. Could there be any stronger tribute to Grant than the hardiness of his army compared to the tattered condition of Lee's army? So here is visual testimony. Now, it may be exaggerated, it may be simplistic, but here is a strong visual argument. The better man won. He may not have been the grander man, but he was the better man. These prints, I think, made an enormous difference to the Grant image. And I will end this survey with this final image, which is one of my favorites because it has kind of a trompe-l'oeil effect. It's a picture within a picture. These are images of the highlights of Grant's life from his West Point days to Missionary Ridge. You see the prang image up at the top that we'd seen earlier, to Appomattox, to meeting with Lincoln, and on superimpose this dignified portrait of Grant. And just as the cartoon image of the old bulldog was a Lincoln campaign image, a Lincoln campaign image meant to assure voters remind voters that McClellan was the inferior military man, and to remind them that he had wisely turned to Ulysses S. Grant to win the war. Similarly, this image reminds voters in 1868 and in 1872 that Ulysses S. Grant was his own great American rags to riches story. He had gone to the academy. He had been in the Mexican War. He had gone on to modest but significant glory in the war. He had met Lincoln, shared the goals of victory and emancipation and black enlistment, and they had emerged as equals. And again, in the bottom image, he had accepted the surrender from a man widely believed to be the superior general and the superior person. I think and this is just a smattering, but it's a fascinating story, and it tracks the rise of Grant beautifully. And I would just say one more thing, and then I'll stop. We often see these pictures as illustrations in books, but they weren't illustrations in their day. Pictures were enormously important to people as icons, almost like religious icons. People displayed them on their walls, in their veterans halls, in the Sons of Union Veterans headquarters, in Republican lodges and clubs. Before the days of doing podcasts and Zooms, when images became so commonplace, and before the days of magazines, before the days of illustrations, photographic illustrations in newspapers, these pictures were precious and revered. So the reason I've written about images all these years is that they were too long ignored as genuine historic, quote, documents, not just relics, but things that can inform us about public attitudes about leaders. I think these pictures not only recorded the transfiguration of Grant from military force to military hero, and of course there's a whole slew of civilian presidential images and images of Grant's death, of course, and funeral. I think they not only record that image, I think they help influence the development of the Grant image.